In a world that is facing unprecedented increases in population and with larger and larger cities, you could wonder, do cities have limits? Well, the truth is, well, yes. That's why in some countries they're opting for a much more drastic solution than normal. I'm referring to the so-called cities from scratch. But what exactly are cities from scratch? Well, with cities from scratch, we're talking about cities that are created, constructed, and populated where there used to be absolutely nothing more than a vast expanse of land or sea. Take, for example, Songdo in South Korea. Songdo, which was also turned into a special economic zone, is one of the world's greatest examples of what a city built from scratch should be. It's a true example of success. And well, some of the others, they didn't go so well, and some, they were a complete failure. But let's pause for a second. Some of you might be thinking that this is a bit crazy. I mean, isn't it too expensive to just build a city from absolutely nothing? Well, yeah, you're kind of absolutely right. China, for example, has used more concrete in the last 3 years than the United States did throughout the entire 20th century. But why are so many new cities being built right now? Is it just about offering more housing to the people coming from the countryside, or are there more reasons behind it? Well, let's take a closer look.
The power of cities.
It is a fact that power is concentrated in cities. And I'm not only talking about political power here, I'm also talking about economic power, industrial power, artistic power, cultural power. Cities are something of a cocktail of elements that lead to a prosperity explosion. And it's precisely beneath all that prosperity that we find the reasons to create new cities from scratch. But you may be wondering, well, where the hell are all of these new cities being built? Well, let's see. In Europe, I can think of very few examples that fit, but in America, there are some, but they're on a much smaller scale. So, well, where can they be? Any ideas? Well, yes, you probably got it. Asia is the greatest proponent of new cities in the world, and within Asia, there's one country that has taken it to the extreme. China has built more than 600 cities from scratch since the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, and not all of these cities were built with the same function in mind. For example, some are centers of state or regional political power, others are oriented towards logistics, others are technological, many others seek to be trade and finance centers, and of course some are just chiefly residential. However, the bottom line is that the purpose of the city doesn't really matter. They're all built with a common ambition: to be engines of long-term economic growth.
China plans to build new city nearly 3 times the size of New York.
Yes, we're talking about an extreme case of urban planning, but market-targeted planning, which doesn't necessarily mean that it'll go well, but, we're going to see more about that in a bit. The point here is that the relationship between cities and economic development isn't only being pursued by China, but also by other developing countries that are experiencing a fast transfer of people from the countryside to cities. And I can tell you that this is something we're going to be talking about in the future on VisualPolitik, so, be sure to subscribe if you're into that. You see, this isn't only happening in Asia. In Africa, there are projects such as the Eco-Atlantic in Nigeria, Hope City in Ghana, Konza in Kenya, or the new administrative capital, yep, that's the name, in Egypt. Of course, in order for this to be a success, we need to know how to build a city from scratch, and for that, we must take many important things into account, such as location, water supply, capital investment, public transport, and waste management, among many other things. And let's not forget to create a city identity within which people feel comfortable and integrated. As you can imagine, all this is very expensive. That's why not all the cities have worked as planned. Even considering all the risk, new city fever is very common in several developing countries. So before we go on, we need to consider something. Do all cities follow the same model? Are they all driven in the same way? Listen closely to the answer, because it might just surprise you.
The paradigm of public and private cities.
Yes, folks, you heard that right. Private cities. As with everything, there isn't just one way of doing things, and therefore there isn't a single city management model. Now, it is true, most cities are driven and managed by the public sector, that is, by the state, by governments. But folks, a small number of them have been created and managed by the private sector, and some are more successful than others. But let me ask you a question now. What do you think are the main differences between these two models? When we talk about private cities, you may imagine a huge wall with security guards at the doors controlling who can or cannot pass, or perhaps charging a fee for entry. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Private cities are ordinary cities whose only peculiarity is that they have been designed, built, and later managed by one or more private companies. That is, instead of receiving services from the public administration through the municipality and taxes, these services are provided by private companies through a kind of general service contract that the residents sign when they move in that is paid annually. Perhaps one of the best examples of this is Reston. See, Reston is a private city in Virginia in the United States. It belongs to Fairfax County. Founded in the early 1960s, it was conceived as a set of company-created owner communities, and is more or less continued this way to this day. These communities have their own private security service, garbage collection, and public transport. And it looks like things have gone quite well. The city saw huge population growth. Between 1970 and 1980 alone, the population skyrocketed from less than 6,000 to more than 36,000, which is a 536% increase in just 10 years. Today, more than 60,000 people live in Reston, and it makes sense. Reston, for example, has been catalogued by a CNN study as one of the best small cities in the United States to live in. And that isn't the only example. Lavasa in India is a private city in development that will have an area of 100 square kilometers and 300,000 inhabitants when completed. Today, it's one of the best places to live in India thanks to its services. In any event, we'll need to see if this way of making cities takes off in the upcoming years. Because the truth is, most cities don't follow this private model. And folks, let's not kid ourselves. A new city being public or private doesn't define its success or failure. Several factors come into play to make cities as we want them to be, true hubs of growth and prosperity. And among them, the most important one is urban planning, with a vision of the future, but also remaining realistic and thinking about the people. Well, there is a country where these basic concepts have gotten quite out of hand, so listen up.
China, 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 China.
Dangers of becoming an addict.
China, I love them. China, China.
Cities, cities, and more cities. We told you at the beginning, China has a clear idea in mind. The future is in the cities.
And China, 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 China. I love China.
But to what extent? When should a country say stop? We don't need any more cities. Well, folks, the Chinese government doesn't seem to want to see what the rest of the world sees, that they have a bit of a problem. They're going to need a lot of people to inhabit their mammoth cities that have been built from scratch.
China's shrinking cities are still addicted to building, despite population slump.
And of course, building a city with everyone else's money leads to a huge illusion of economic prosperity. A lot of players become involved and whole economic sectors continue to work thanks to the new city's construction. For example, Chinese local governments have covered a lot of their budget for years thanks to real estate developments in these new cities. You see, in the year 2000, land sales accounted for 9.3% of municipal revenues in China. Well, consider this. In 2011, after more than 10 years of new city booms, this amount reached a whopping 74.1% of total revenues. Basically, they thought they'd found the goose that laid the golden eggs. According to a joint study done by Landesa Renmin University and Michigan State University, Chinese municipalities earned 40 times more money selling lands for urban development than they had to pay to expropriate them. And in the case of lands reclaimed from the sea, this ratio could increase up to 100 times more. With these numbers, it doesn't seem like bad business, right? However, just hold on for a second before we start ringing the bells of celebration. On the one hand, local governments spent all that money, and much more, building infrastructure and projects of all kinds. After all, it seemed like the money was always going to just fall from the sky, and when the apartments were full of people, they'd get more and more money. There was such euphoria that several local governments even ended up becoming developers, which led them to accumulate a huge amount of debt. But of course, this model is enormously short-sighted and is quickly losing ground in China. I mean, if you extend the process too much, you'll end up with dozens of completely empty cities full of abandoned or half-built residential blocks because nobody's living in them. And forget about new taxes and all that. Of course, the debt, it won't disappear. Well, that's exactly what's happening. As you can see in the graph, at the national level, the square kilometers built have already surpassed the units of 10,000 people living in urban areas. And 10,000 inhabitants per square kilometer is considered a good measure of population density for the new Chinese cities. Basically, this means that the rhythm of construction is already much quicker than the urban population growth required to occupy those new cities. That is the perfect recipe for building empty cities, or as they're known in China, ghost cities.
China local government's hidden debt could total $5.8 trillion.
So we could say that the local Chinese governments have been affected by something like the Dutch disease, the curse of natural resources. Although in this case, instead of natural resources, we have real estate promotions that are financed and promoted by China's own public banks. Even so, Chinese President Xi Jinping has a very different opinion. The president himself has promoted the construction of another new city from scratch. His personal project, or the new area of Shaogan, is an area 120 kilometers from Beijing that is connected by a 20-minute trip from the Chinese capital by high-speed train. She wants it to become a hub for the technology industry. We're talking about a completely ecological city for which so many trees are going to be planted that the forest cover in the area will expand from 11 to 40%. With all this, we can assure you of something. China plans to continue building new cities despite having many empty or clearly underpopulated ones. So we must ask ourselves, will the Chinese new city bubble definitely explode? And if so, how will this affect their economy? We've already told you that one of China's features is its enormous level of savings, which may indeed finance all of these wasteful expenses. But is it really reasonable to waste so much money on cities that are often just ending up empty? Will real estate developers and banks go bankrupt? What could happen to the global economy if this true addiction to building new cities expanded to other developing countries? Is it bread today and perhaps hunger tomorrow? Well, leave your answer in the comments below, and I really hope you did enjoy this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.